January 1945. In the cold, wind-swept fields of a prison camp in rural France, a convoy of trucks rumbles to a halt. The men aboard, battered by months of confinement and deprivation, watch in silence as a small group of Allied soldiers unload crates. The faint sound of laughter drifts through the frozen air, a rarity in these grim surroundings. For the German prisoners, each day in captivity is a reminder of the destruction that has torn their world apart. They are exhausted, hungry, and desperate for anything that might break the monotony of their routine. But nothing prepares them for what happens next. Inside the mess hall, the guards bring forth the unexpected, a drink that, to the men, seems as surreal as it is lavish. A thick, creamy liquid, brown as the earth itself, is served to them in metal cups. It's chocolate milk. A moment of silence descends. The men exchange confused glances, disbelief settling in their eyes. Chocolate milk? It's a luxury few had tasted since childhood, and for many, it now represents a strange and unsettling kindness from the very people who had defeated them. For the German POWs, it is more than just a meal. It's a symbol, a shock to their senses, and to the very notion of their captivity. The moment is frozen in time, and yet it speaks volumes about the war, the prisoners, and the Allies who found a way to use something as simple as chocolate milk to change the course of history. As the war dragged on through the early 1940s, millions of soldiers found themselves far from their homes, bound by the fate of their captors. By 1944, the number of German soldiers held in Allied prisoner-of-war camps was rising rapidly, a result of the shifting momentum in favor of the Allies following the D-Day landings in June. These camps were spread across Europe, often in rural areas, isolated from the comforts of civilization. For many, being taken as a prisoner was a bitter pill to swallow. It was not just a military defeat, but a blow to their sense of duty and honor. Most German prisoners of war found themselves in the hands of the British, Americans, and French. These men, primarily young soldiers who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht, were not prepared for the hardships of captivity. Many were still in their teens or early 20s, and the psychological toll of being a POW was heavy. The men, once proud soldiers, now wore the uniforms of the defeated, treated not as warriors, but as prisoners. The sight of barbed wire and armed guards, the feeling of constant vigilance, and the relentless grind of monotonous daily routines were a far cry from the exhilaration of combat. Despite the Geneva Conventions, which outlined the treatment of POWs, conditions in many camps were grim. Rations were sparse, clothing insufficient for the bitter winters, and the constant uncertainty about the future gnawed at the prisoners' morale. The Allies, though adhering to many of the conventions, were not immune to the brutal realities of war. POW camps were often overrun, overcrowded, and faced logistical difficulties. But there were differences, important differences, that marked the POW experience under the Western Allies compared to that of those in Nazi custody. For many German POWs, life in an Allied camp was a sharp contrast to the brutal treatment they might have experienced in Soviet captivity. While the Soviet Union was notorious for its harsh treatment of German prisoners, the Western Allies, especially the British and Americans, took a more humanitarian approach, at least in terms of maintaining the prisoners' basic needs. Yet it was still war. They were still prisoners, and while they were not starved or subjected to forced labor on the scale seen in other parts of Europe, they were often kept in camps far from home, separated from their families, and deprived of the comforts of civilian life. This bleak existence could be punctuated only by the occasional small mercy, a glimmer of humanity that broke through the walls of captivity. It wasn't often, but when it came, it had a profound impact on the men who received it. One such mercy was the surprise of a simple, yet strangely luxurious offering: chocolate milk. The role of food in the POW experience cannot be overstated. For the prisoners, It was a constant preoccupation. What they ate, and when they ate, became a central part of their daily lives. The rations were basic: bread, potatoes, some form of protein, and a meager portion of vegetables. Sometimes these rations were supplemented with whatever the Allies could provide, but they were rarely anything to celebrate. A typical POW meal was far from a banquet. It was functional, designed to keep prisoners alive, but not to indulge them. In the Western Allied camps, however, there was a recognition of the importance of maintaining morale. This understanding led to efforts to improve conditions as much as possible. Given the constraints of wartime logistics, prisoners were given enough food to sustain them, but there was an additional layer to the care the Allies took in feeding them. Small gestures designed to foster a sense of dignity and, when possible, comfort. Food became a powerful tool in psychological warfare. The Allies understood that to keep prisoners from turning sullen or rebellious, they needed to feel as if they were treated as human beings. Beyond the mere labels of enemy combatants, small acts of kindness, like the occasional inclusion of extra items in a meal, could go a long way in breaking down the emotional walls between captor and captive. It wasn't about providing luxuries, but about providing enough to lift the spirits of men who were, after all, still soldiers. For the German prisoners, receiving something like chocolate milk in the middle of their captivity was a surreal moment. Chocolate milk was not just a drink, it represented an indulgence, a momentary return to a childhood memory, to a simpler time. It was a symbol of something beyond survival. It was a reminder that life, despite the war, still contained moments of sweetness. To the German soldiers who had lived through the brutal hardships of the Eastern Front, or had witnessed the collapse of their homeland, this gesture was not lost on them. The psychological effect was profound. Many prisoners later recalled that the sight of the chocolate milk was as disorienting as it was heartening. It was not the type of food they expected from their captors. It wasn't just sustenance. It was something unexpected, a kindness that left them bewildered and, in some cases, grateful. But why chocolate milk? The decision wasn't just random. Allied planners knew that small, comforting luxuries like this could serve as a subtle tool to weaken the resolve of the enemy. It wasn't a strategic military victory in the traditional sense, but it was a victory nonetheless, a victory for morale, for humanity, and for the idea that kindness, in the midst of war, could be a weapon in its own right. The decision to include such comforts in the rations of German POWs wasn't taken lightly. Logistics had to be carefully considered. The chocolate milk had to be produced, transported, and distributed efficiently. At the time, the Allies were dealing with massive logistical challenges, and ensuring that a treat like chocolate milk reached the camps was no small feat. But it was seen as a crucial part of maintaining control over the psychological aspect of captivity. For many prisoners, this small act of kindness was one that stood out in their memories of their time as POWs. A strange, humanizing touch in the midst of the grim realities of war. For the German prisoners of war, the act of receiving chocolate milk was a moment of deep emotional conflict. In that brief instance, the walls of the prison camp seemed to fade away, and the brutal reality of their captivity was momentarily softened by something as simple as a drink that represented more than just sustenance. It was something they had not expected from their captors. Many of these men had been raised with an ingrained sense of nationalism, taught that their enemies were to be feared, defeated, and never shown mercy. But now, standing in the mess hall, facing the Allies who had brought them to this point, they were confronted with an unexpected gift. The first taste of the chocolate milk was described by many as a surreal experience. The drink was rich and sweet, far more luxurious than the watered-down rations they were accustomed to. For a moment, the cold, harsh surroundings of the camp seemed to blur into the background, replaced by the nostalgic comfort of childhood. For many, it was a brief reminder of better days, a time when life had been simpler and less fraught with the horrors of war. Yet, As the initial shock of the surprise wore off, the emotions became more complex. Some prisoners felt a sense of guilt. How could they accept such a gesture from the people they had been taught to hate? How could they allow themselves to enjoy something so indulgent when their comrades were still fighting, still risking their lives on the front lines? This feeling of internal conflict was common among the men, especially those who had spent years in the unforgiving heat of battle or the freezing cold of the Russian steppes. To drink chocolate milk was to acknowledge that, in some small way, the war was over for them. They were no longer combatants, but prisoners, their fate now in the hands of those who had defeated them. So to thief. For others, the chocolate milk was a moment of clarity, a reminder that, despite everything, they were still human. The small act of kindness felt like a break from the relentless weight of captivity, a glimmer of normality in a world turned upside down. It was a rare instance when they were treated not as enemies, but as people. In the cold, indifferent machinery of war, such small moments had an outsized impact. As the milk warmed their insides, so too did the realization that not all was lost. There was still humanity, even in the midst of destruction. The emotional range of reactions to the chocolate milk varied widely, but the common thread was this: it shattered the expectation of total hostility. It was a reminder that, even in war, acts of kindness could exist. And in that moment, for many prisoners, the simple act of receiving chocolate milk was more powerful than any weapon they had ever faced. From a purely tactical standpoint, the decision to offer chocolate milk to German POWs might seem like a trivial gesture. However, it was part of a broader psychological strategy employed by the Allies to maintain control over the prisoners and to ensure that they remained compliant, peaceful, and even amenable to cooperation. The Allies recognized that the physical well-being of POWs was important, but they also understood the critical role that morale played in maintaining order in the camps and preventing uprisings or attempts at escape. In the context of World War II, food was more than just fuel for the body. It was a tool in the psychological warfare that unfolded daily in the POW camps. The Allies, especially the British and Americans, had a deep understanding of the importance of maintaining the morale of their prisoners. Providing extra comforts, such as chocolate milk, was a way to create a sense of dependency. By offering this simple luxury, they reinforced their role as the provider, the force in control of the prisoners' lives. For the Germans, the surprise of receiving such a treat was more than just a momentary indulgence. It was an attempt to subtly influence their minds, to shift their perceptions. These small acts of kindness could work to undermine the resolve of the prisoners, particularly in the final years of the war, when many soldiers were beginning to question the righteousness of their cause. By offering them something pleasant, the Allies sent a message. "You are our prisoners now, but we will treat you with respect." It was a stark contrast to the brutal tactics employed by the Germans in their treatment of prisoners, especially those from the Soviet Union. The underlying strategy was clear. By softening the experience of captivity, the Allies hoped to create a psychological environment where the prisoners would feel less inclined to resist or fight back. This kind of psychological manipulation was not new to wartime strategy. Both sides of the conflict used food and comfort as tools to maintain control. In this case, chocolate milk was an effective tool, a seemingly insignificant gesture that had the potential to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of German soldiers. It wasn't just about kindness, it was about shifting the power dynamics, making the prisoners feel as if they were under the influence of their captors. The milk was a reminder that they were no longer in control, that they had been defeated. It was a small but potent way to reinforce the idea that, even in their most basic needs, they were now reliant on their captors. The logistics behind providing chocolate milk to POWs may seem straightforward, but in the context of wartime supply chains, it was anything but. Ensuring that POWs received such an indulgence involved careful coordination between military planners, nutritionists, and the supply chains responsible for getting food to the camps. Chocolate milk wasn't a standard issue in the Allied rations, so it had to be manufactured, transported, and delivered with efficiency. The production of chocolate milk for POWs required collaboration between the Allies' military food departments and local suppliers. In some cases, the chocolate was produced by military contractors who had already been supplying food to the troops, but making sure it reached the POW camps was another challenge. Given the state of the war, transportation across Europe was difficult, and each camp had different logistical needs. Yet the Allies went to great lengths to make sure that this small luxury was available to their prisoners. The logistics were carefully planned to ensure that chocolate milk was not just a rare occurrence, but something that could be distributed with some regularity. It wasn't simply a token gesture, but a strategic part of the Allies' ongoing efforts to manage their prisoners. The production process also had to ensure that the milk could be transported without spoiling, which required careful planning in terms of refrigeration and timing. For the soldiers who drank it, the chocolate milk was not just a rare treat. It was a sign that, despite the brutal nature of the war, there was still an effort to preserve some semblance of dignity in the worst of circumstances. The technology behind getting that chocolate milk from the factory to the prisoner's cup was a testament to the ingenuity of wartime logistics, using the tools of war, not just to defeat the enemy, but to change the emotional and psychological landscape of the battlefield. The decision to serve chocolate milk to German POWs was not one made in isolation. It was the result of thoughtful planning by the Allied commanders, who understood that the treatment of prisoners had lasting implications beyond the immediate tactical advantages of the war. They recognized that their approach to handling POWs could set a precedent for post-war diplomacy and the treatment of soldiers who would return home after the war. For the leaders in charge of the POW camps, the gesture was a reflection of their broader views on morality and warfare. They understood that while their duty was to win the war, they also had a responsibility to uphold certain ethical standards, even in the darkest days of conflict. The provision of small comforts like chocolate milk was a reminder of the humanity that still existed within the Allied forces, a stark contrast to the ruthlessness displayed by the Axis powers. Some commanders believed that by providing this simple luxury, they could more effectively break the will of the German soldiers and bring about the end of the war. The idea was that if the prisoners saw themselves treated with kindness, it might erode their resolve to continue the fight. This approach was grounded in a belief in the power of psychological tactics, which had already been demonstrated in numerous instances throughout the war. The moment the German prisoners first saw the chocolate milk, it struck like a wave of disorienting emotion. They had been conditioned to expect only deprivation and hardship, to see only the sharp edge of war's cruelty. And yet here, in a small corner of a grim POW camp, something was different. A drink they had not seen since childhood, chocolate milk, was presented to them as though it were just another part of their daily ration. The surprise was immediate, and the reactions varied wildly. Some prisoners stood in stunned silence, staring at the metal cup in front of them, unable to comprehend that they were being given something so indulgent. It was almost as though they were waiting for a catch, for the moment when the reality of their situation would return with a jolt. The milk was too sweet, too comforting to come from their captors, who were supposed to be their enemies. They were far from home, imprisoned in a foreign land, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. How could they be treated this way? Others took the milk without hesitation, their faces betraying a mix of confusion and cautious gratitude. They sipped it slowly, savoring the creamy taste that seemed to offer more than just nourishment. It was a reminder of the world outside the camp, of a time before the war, before the destruction of their homes and families. It was a fleeting escape from the stark reality of their captivity. For a brief moment, they were no longer soldiers in a defeated army. They were just men, experiencing a rare moment of pleasure amidst the suffering. But for some, the experience was more complicated. Many German POWs, particularly those who had been through the worst of the war on the Eastern Front, or had witnessed the bombing campaigns against their homeland, felt a sense of shame. To accept such a gift from the very people who had defeated them seemed to betray their national pride. How could they, in good conscience, enjoy a treat when their comrades were still fighting on the front lines? How could they, in the face of their suffering, acknowledge the kindness of the enemy? This internal conflict manifested in different ways. Some prisoners became withdrawn, unsure how to react to the unexpected kindness. Others, more vocal, questioned the meaning of the gesture. Was this an attempt to weaken their resolve? Was it a subtle way of making them feel complicit in their own defeat? But even those who struggled with the moral implications of the chocolate milk could not deny the psychological effect it had on them. For many, it was a moment that shattered the illusion of the harshness of their captors. The line between enemy and ally blurred, if only for a moment. As the days passed, the initial shock of receiving the milk began to give way to something deeper. A quiet realization that perhaps this small act of kindness was a reflection of the broader ethos of the Allies, who sought to maintain a sense of humanity even in the darkest moments of the war. It was a contrast to the brutality of the Nazis, who had subjected their own prisoners to unimaginable horrors. For many of the German soldiers, the chocolate milk became a symbol of defeat, but also of something more, something human. The impact of receiving chocolate milk wasn't confined to the moment of surprise and confusion. It rippled through the camp, reverberating in ways that would have lasting consequences on the psychological landscape of the prisoners. The gesture, though small, had a profound effect on the way many POWs viewed their situation. It wasn't just about the milk, it was about what it represented. For many, it was a subtle yet powerful acknowledgement that their captors were different from what they had imagined. This moment of humanity served as a turning point in the way the prisoners perceived their position in the war. In the midst of their suffering, it reminded them that not all was lost. They were still men, still human, and they could still experience moments of kindness, even from those they had once viewed as enemies. Morale, which had been low in many of the camps, began to shift. The realization that they were not simply pawns in a cold, uncaring war machine, but individuals capable of receiving comfort and care, began to erode the walls of bitterness and resentment. The psychological toll of captivity was immense, and small gestures like the chocolate milk were a lifeline to many. Prisoners who had spent years in the brutal grind of warfare. The long-term impact was not just a matter of boosting the prisoners' spirits in the immediate term. It had a strategic purpose. The Allies knew that if they could break down the psychological resistance of the German soldiers, they would be able to weaken their resolve further, hastening the process of surrender. The provision of small comforts, though seemingly insignificant, was a calculated move designed to disrupt the mental fortitude of the prisoners. In this sense, chocolate milk wasn't just a treat. It was a tool in the psychological arsenal of the Allies, a way to break the spirit of the enemy in ways that tanks and bullets could not. Moreover, the experience of receiving such a treat was something that stayed with the prisoners long after the war had ended. Many of them recalled the moment with a sense of bewilderment and even gratitude. It was a strange and unexpected kindness in the midst of chaos, a reminder that even in the most inhumane of circumstances, humanity could still find a way to manifest itself. In the immediate aftermath of receiving the chocolate milk, the German POWs were left to grapple with the emotional and psychological effects of the experience. For many, it was a brief respite from the grimness of captivity, a momentary escape from the hunger, the cold, and the feeling of utter powerlessness. Yet, even this small comfort could not erase the reality of their situation. They were still prisoners, still far from home, and still under the control of their captors. The reactions to the chocolate milk continued to vary in the days following the event. Some prisoners felt a renewed sense of human dignity, touched by the unexpected kindness. They began to speak more openly about their experiences, some even beginning to question the propaganda they had been fed about the Allies. These small gestures of humanity had a subtle but powerful impact on their morale. It wasn't just about the milk, it was about the recognition that they were not seen as mere enemies, but as individuals. For others, however, the internal conflict remained. The chocolate milk had momentarily softened the edges of their bitterness, but it couldn't fully erase the shame of being a prisoner. Many German soldiers had been raised with an ingrained sense of duty to their country and their comrades, and to accept kindness from the enemy was a difficult pill to swallow. But over time, some came to view it less as a weakness, and more as a reminder of the humanity that existed even in the darkest of wars. Despite the varied reactions, there was no denying the psychological impact the chocolate milk had on the POWs. It was a stark reminder of the stark contrast between the way the Allies treated their prisoners and the brutality exhibited by the Axis powers, particularly Nazi Germany. This moment, small as it was, would remain etched in the memories of many prisoners long after the war ended. The long-term impact of the chocolate milk gesture extended beyond the immediate POW experience. It was a reflection of the Allied understanding of the importance of psychological tactics in warfare. While the German soldiers were held in captivity, the Allies knew that the treatment of POWs could have significant effects on the war effort. By offering small comforts like chocolate milk, they not only weakened the prisoners' resolve, but also demonstrated a key difference between the Allied and Axis ideologies. For the Allied forces, the treatment of POWs was part of a broader strategy aimed at maintaining morale, not just for the soldiers on the front lines, but for the prisoners who had been taken. The idea was simple. By showing kindness to their prisoners, the Allies could help ensure a smoother transition to post-war recovery. The gesture of providing chocolate milk was just one example of how food and other small luxuries could be used to influence the psychological state of the enemy. After the war, the treatment of POWs by the Allies became a point of pride. In contrast to the harshness and cruelty often associated with the Axis powers, the Allies' humane treatment of prisoners stood as a testament to their values. The small act of providing chocolate milk encapsulated the broader strategy of psychological warfare, emphasizing that war, for all its horrors, still allowed for moments of humanity. In the years following the war, many of the German POWs who had experienced this kindness would recall the moment of receiving chocolate milk as a symbol of the unexpected humanity they encountered during their captivity. It was a memory that stood out among the many dark moments of their time in the camps. A reminder that, even in war, there was room for mercy, for compassion, and for the small but powerful acts that can change the course of a soldier's psyche. The story of the German POWs and their reaction to chocolate milk offers a profound lesson about the human capacity for both cruelty and kindness, even in the most extreme circumstances. In the midst of the devastation of war, where millions of lives were shattered, this small act of humanity, serving a simple drink, became a symbol of something far greater. It wasn't just about chocolate milk. It was about the enduring power of empathy, the ability of one side to see the humanity in the other, even in the face of bitter conflict. For the prisoners, that moment in the mess hall became a turning point, not just in their perception of the Allies, but in their understanding of the very nature of warfare. It was a brief, surprising reminder that, despite the horrors surrounding them, they were still people, not just soldiers, not just captives, but men deserving of dignity. In a world that had been ravaged by destruction, this small moment of kindness stood out. It was, for many, a glimmer of hope, a reminder that, no matter how dark the world became, there could still be a space for small mercies. And in the broader context of history, the act of offering chocolate milk was a quiet, but significant example of the psychological warfare employed by the Allies. It wasn't about winning battles with weapons, but with the mind. By offering this simple indulgence, the Allies demonstrated a willingness to break down the walls of animosity. to humanize their prisoners, and to make a statement about what kind of world they envisioned after the war. As the war drew to a close, and the prisoners eventually returned to their homes, many would carry with them not only memories of suffering, but also the strange, lingering memory of chocolate milk, the unexpected moment of kindness amidst the cruelty of war. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, the smallest gestures can leave the deepest impressions.